This is the moral task of our species, to develop a more just society without any guidelines from anything other than ourselves. And that gives our species its ultimate meaning.
You're listening to The Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to Benjamin Gregg, the author of Human Rights as a Social Construction and Creating Human Nature, the Political Challenges of Genetic Engineering. Because Benjamin Gregg is a professor here in Austin, Texas, I was able to sit down with him in person and have an in-depth discussion about some really significant topics, like, are human rights a social construct? If they are, how do you socially construct them? And what rights do we need to think about in the future? Do you have the right, for example, to be free from genetic engineering before you're born? I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion because in his book, Benjamin Gregg argues that human rights are a social construct, but that thinking about human rights as a social construct actually makes them stronger. So, without further ado, here is Benjamin Gregg. I read your book, Human Rights as a Social Construction, and that is a phenomenal book. And it's got a lot in it. But I want to start with sort of the most basic question, which is, what are human rights?
Human rights, first of all, are plural. There isn't any single understanding that's agreed upon. There are many understandings, and some of these understandings are incompatible with each other. What they share is an interest in justice, and there are different forms of justice. Justice is also something that requires definition and so forth. But we have justice, for example, in a domestic legal system where the laws are legitimate because they have been legislated by persons who have the proper authority to do so. You have a judicial system that interprets them, and then you have a system that will enforce them. That is one conception of justice. The idea of human rights is generally a notion of justice that is not tied entirely to the nation state, or indeed might be used against the nation state, its legal understandings and its legal system and enforcement systems. And it is also a conception of justice that is keen not to distinguish between and among peoples. Whereas, of course, a domestic system is precisely that. There are no Miranda rights in Canada. And that's not necessarily a problem. But the idea of human rights is that whatever they are, they would more or less apply to all people at all times. Problem is, how do we define them? We could make a list. What's on that list? What isn't? How would you rank order them? On what basis? And where do they come from? There is a strong element, I believe, in our species that may be cognizant of how frail we humans are in a variety of ways, including we're needy, we are judgmental, maybe perspectival, we may be ignorant, we may be emotional, things that might get in the way of creating a good ethical, moral, legal system. And because of this suspicion, perhaps, there is a strong drive in many cases to locate the source of human rights somewhere else. Metaphysically, as a feature of the landscape, theologically, in one or more gods, and so forth. I argue that these are implausible sources And they actually take away from a central task of human rights, and that is that we humans have good reason to give ourselves human rights. I would argue that we have no alternative but to give them to ourselves. I would argue that they are not lesser in terms of their cogency and meaningfulness and usefulness because they are of human hand. The difficulty remains how to define and order them, but those are problems that don't undermine the project of seeking after human rights because, for a variety of reasons, there are many things that our species share with itself. We all have bodies that are vulnerable to illness, to aging, to death. We are needy. We humans know the difference between being respected and being disrespected, and so forth. No one wants to be a slave, etc. There are these understandings that we share and that offer some basis for thinking about rules that we might think should apply to all human beings.
One thing I find really interesting about your book is that you argue that framing human rights as a social construction actually makes them stronger. Because I think a lot of people, the view I learned in school was, endowed by your creator with certain inalienable rights, a view that human rights are universal and almost exist whether or not we believe in them or not. And it sounds like that your perspective is different. And I'm curious why you feel differently about that. Or is there something wrong with the inalienable view, or is there a problem with that? Or how is it that they would get stronger if viewed as a social construction?
The idea that there are self-evident rights, I think, is implausible. Rights are a creation of the human mind, a remarkable creation of the human mind, and a creation that has done a lot of good for us. It's done a lot of bad too. If you define rights, for example, as Northern European Protestants and not rights as indigenous peoples of North America and South America and Africans, then we have a definition of rights that is problematic. Although even the idea that some groups enjoy rights might pose a question: then why don't other groups enjoy the same rights? This working out of rights is the task that we have. And if you regard human rights as something to be discovered, what will you discover? You might discover the prejudices of your own culture, or the fact that the culture that lords it over others it gets the right to define rights and so forth. I believe that while our species is one species in a genetic sense, any single human being could represent our entire species just as well as any other individual human being. But that's biology. When we're talking about rights, we're talking about culture, and cultures are created, and the way we humans create things has to do in part with our backgrounds and so forth. And therefore, and this is my point, we should expect some differences of opinion in various ways. And so I think that different peoples might define human rights in various ways. I believe that those various sets of definitions will overlap to an extent and will not overlap in other ways. But once we have those overlaps, we can think about expanding them. And even if, at the end of the day, we have a plurality of definitions of sets of human rights that don't reduce to one list, we're still better off, I believe, than thinking that someone, generally me, not you, has a special connection to the universe or to the gods where I know what looks very much like a human creation, in fact, is not.
It sounds like there's a danger if you come from the view that rights are something that you discover, if they're actually a cultural construct, that you would assume that your cultural construct is the universal that you get to impose on everyone else. Which, one of the things I found really interesting is you talk about how the universal definition of human rights can lead to a sort of cultural imperialism where, well, our culture has the rights and we know what's best and yours doesn't. And so you need to follow our rules.
Yes. And in fact, you can observe these cultural traces very much in documents that proclaim human rights. For example, as has often been observed, we in the West, I think because of our Greek and Roman heritage, have an individualism that tends to be greater than what one finds, for example, in the Confucian cultures of China, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, where, for example, the concept of saving face is very, very strong, and also social cohesion. And in some, if one defined rights in terms of individualism, you don't get exactly the same set as when you would define human rights in ways that would not privilege the individual, but maybe privilege the group. That's an example, and there are many others.
I have a quote from another author, Yuval Noah Harari, that
Yes.
You may have heard this. It made a lot of people very upset online, and I wanted to see if you agreed with it. Human rights, just like God and heaven, are just a story that we've invented. They are not objective reality. They are not some biological effect about Homo sapiens. Take a human being, cut him open, look inside. You will find the heart, the kidneys, neurons, hormones, DNA, but you won't find any rights. The only place you find rights are in the stories that we've invented and spread over the last few centuries. They may be very positive stories, very good stories, but they're still just fictional stories that we invented. I'm curious if you would agree with that or have some...
I agree that human rights are not an objective feature of the natural universe or have some theological or metaphysical otherworldly source. I do find his tone dismissive.
I think you say something better in your book.
Because they are not idle stories. There are such things as idle stories. There are such things as stories that are not idle at all, but have tremendous meaning. When we create ethical systems to guide our behavior, that is not an idle undertaking. Rather, I would say it's core to what we are as human beings. We are always our biology, but we are never only our biology. We know this in many ways. For example, the natural universe has no meaning. And when you do natural science, you don't discover meanings, you discover truths. We humans are, on the one hand, as an evolved organism, part of this natural universe. But at the same time, we have a cognitive capacity and I think a psychological need for meaning in profound ways. To suffer is terrible. To suffer without meaning is even worse. We die, and people we love die, and we're not indifferent to that. And we can construct, through rights and other forms of culture, ways that allow us to cope better with life, and then beyond that, we can magnify what we are biologically. In the sense that, for example, with reading and writing, We can have records of the past and know things about peoples that are long gone. And I think that kind of knowledge is also a way that we humans can realize our potential in ways that are deeply meaningful and gratifying to human beings. Dogs and cats live the same life every day. Human beings have a capacity to live between and among generations, and that gives so much meaning. Where we came from, our progenitors and our children and grandchildren are more than simply the reproduction of our DNA. They are that. But a DNA itself is not sentient. It doesn't care. But we human beings are both.
I think a lot of people were upset with his quote because they felt like he was being dismissive of human rights. Like, oh, it's just a story.
Right.
And from your perspective, our stories are everything.
Absolutely. Yes. Not all stories, but some stories.
Yeah.
Absolutely. For example, the United States of America was founded as a slave society. Slavery had been in North America since 1692, and it's never not controversial. And we know that the southern states would never agree to join with the northern states if they were not permitted to practice slavery. The Constitution doesn't mention the word. That silence is telling. There's an embarrassment there. Of course, it comes forth elsewhere when they talk about, for example, counting certain persons as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of representation. And the men and women who created that system were not indifferent. And I would say that the great capacity of that document of 1787 is to ultimately highlight the fact that slavery is incompatible with the overall vision of a self-determining people that allows significant determination also of individuals. That cannot be reconciled. And so the story that we tell in the Constitution, in a sense, is a story of what we want to be. And I think that the stories told by the authoritative interpretation of the Constitution over long periods of time is a working out of that story where we say, yes, actually, slavery is incompatible. Or the wholesale exclusion of women is incompatible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For people who were slaves or women who understood what it's like to be marginalized, the story of why slavery is an morally unacceptable idea, or why proclaiming women as morally and intellectually and in other ways inferior to men is morally unacceptable, are stories that have a profound consequence for the quality of lives. And so Harari is wrong to treat it so flippantly. It should be treated with all of the moral weight it deserves. It doesn't mean that everything in that story is good. There are a lot of problems all the time. But I think it is the case that there has been progress in history, although there's not perfection in history. And so we can, by the stories we tell, improve lives and reduce misery.
It sounds like by framing human rights as a social construct, you have the ability to rewrite and change the story as time goes on for the needs of people. Whereas if you have a sort of fundamentalist view of human rights, well, these are the things we've discovered. If you discover gravity, you can't change gravity.
Right.
But if you recognize that it is a story, then you can rewrite it a little bit, depending on what people need.
I would say, and one can look to maybe the birthplace of very serious textual interpretation, namely great religious texts, that there are no texts that are not interpreted. All texts are interpreted. When one reads a text, I think the reader interprets it for him or herself in some ways. We are not identical. We have different experiences. We're coming from different places. We may have different interests, needs, wants. We may be differently situated. We may live in different societies, in different times, and so forth. And we can never not be who we are. Moreover, we really, really, really need to be able to modify our stories in order to realize our capacity for justice, because any given story will have ethical problems, and I think it's through the reinterpretation that we can improve that story. And this also includes religious texts. And one observes that, in fact, there isn't any such thing as religion. There are always religions, plural, and within any given religion, there are many different streams. That itself is evidence of the plurality of meanings in any text. Another way to look at it, I'm a great lover of theater. And one of the things I love, for example, about Shakespeare, despite, in addition to simply the fantastic quality of his work, is how any particular production will interpret Shakespeare this way. When Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, the main character, Shylock, was an anti-Semitic caricature. In the 21st century, we don't read and we don't perform Shylock as an anti-Semitic caricature. We read and interpret and perform him, I believe, as a great humanist who says, we Jews are just like you Gentiles. We can hurt and we can be happy. And we are not fundamentally different. And then the upshot being is that we really should be treated equally. That's not Shakespeare's Shylock, but why should we be confined to Shakespeare's understanding 5 centuries ago?
I didn't know that about The Merchant of Venice. I haven't read that one. I do know that in Charles Dickens, in one of his books, he has a character who's a bit of an anti-Semitic caricature. And there was a Jewish woman who wrote to him and said, I really didn't like that, and I think you should change it. And he did in later editions of the book. But I think one of the things that people get fearful about when it comes to changing stories or viewing human rights as a social construction is that they'll be changed for the worse.
Yes.
In other words, I have something good. It maybe isn't perfect, but it's working for me. And of course, there are people who would want to change human rights for the worse because it benefits them personally in some way at the expense of the rest of the world. So how is it that you construct human rights in a way that is beneficial or change them in a way that's for the better?
I concede and acknowledge immediately that human life can be terrifying. We don't know the future. The universe is a dangerous place. The environment is a dangerous place. People are quite problematic. And the question poses itself, what are you guided by? How do you know the difference between something better and something worse? I said earlier, there are certain experiences that we can begin with, that all human beings know what it's like to be hurt physically or mentally or in terms of dignity. human beings respond to respect and regard and affection and so forth. We humans can never overcome the fact that we, in designing systems to improve human life and to reduce human misery, do not have guides beyond ourselves. And that is always problematic. That is part of what it is to be a human being. And one consequence is that human history is always a history of tears. And every generation will judge the previous generation as having failed in this or that way. We Americans believe that our founding fathers failed by constitutionalizing slavery, by excluding women, etc. And our generation will also be condemned by the future. There are things that we may be doing right now that we don't realize actually are problematic or should be rejected from a moral point of view. The best we can do is make as much progress as we can, knowing that we will never behave in some way that we are outside of history and we are glorious moral beings. Morality is, as a social construction, something to be defined, but it can be defined in ways that are not idiosyncratic or subjective. They cannot be defined objectively, but they can be defined intersubjectively. That is to say, in a sense of a common consciousness, we, like a culture, where we can create an understanding. Let me give you an example. I'm a professor, so I spend a lot of time at the university. The Western university begins, I believe, in Bologna, about 1,000 years ago. And women are not part of the university in any strong sense, really until the 20th century, really until in the second half of the 20th century. So between the year 1000, let's say, and 1900, if I as a professor walked into a room, or anyone else did, and saw no women there, one wouldn't think twice about it. In 2024, if anyone walks into a room and sees no women in that university classroom, I think the person will say, just a moment, well, that needs an explanation. My point being is that I think we, at least in this part of the world, I'm not talking about the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, have persuaded ourselves collectively that higher education and all of the good that it represents is not to be distributed on the basis of sex. That it would be deeply, deeply unjust to treat women as not having a right to higher education. We persuaded ourselves that in a relatively short amount of time, and now it seems self-evident to us. And I don't think we will ever go back. There's always work to be done. In any given time, we are debating other types of exclusion or marginalization or qualified treatment, and we haven't settled all these issues. And I think in human history, we will never settle all issues as it will. Although, again, I want to emphasize that we can also freely persuade ourselves that there is moral progress in history. Slavery, I believe, is an old system, that is to say probably 10,000 years or more, going back to when you have settled communities. And it was self-evident in many ways. The great Aristotle, for example, regards slavery as a natural characteristic of certain humans. And And we in the world actually have persuaded ourselves that slavery is wrong. And it's no longer done in the way it used to be done, as self-evident and culturally acceptable and so forth. And if there are forms of slavery today, they generally are illegal. And I don't see any future for slavery. And given my understanding that we cannot derive meaning from anything other than our cognitive capacities, our imaginations, our collective imagination, if that is the case, then I would conclude that we have been able to guide ourselves to better societies, to a better future, without otherworldly, supernatural guardrails or guidance. We don't have those anyway, I would say. But this would be in response to your question, well, is it really anything goes? And then how can you distinguish between the horrors of Hitler's Third Reich and what we would regard as, for example, a liberal democratic society dedicated to justice and plurality for all? Those are not the same thing. And I believe that humans can freely persuade themselves of the difference.
So suppose I see something in the world that I feel is harmful and a human rights violation, but the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. How would I go about changing that?
I advocate communication, intercommunication, rational communication. I advocate good arguments, public good arguments. There's no guarantee. There's never a guarantee. But we also have historical examples of where reasoned arguments, maybe with a little help of social movements, which are themselves a form of argument, can be, have persuaded people. Again, in the United States, the two great social movements of the 20th century, the civil rights movement and the women's movement, were movements that had a cognitive content, a moral argument about why discrimination against African Americans and why discrimination against all women is morally reprehensible. And those arguments, I think, have been accepted, as we can see in legislation that codifies them, that juridifies them, that gives them some heft and enforcement, but also in culture, where we today feel some degree of awkwardness when we observe past ways of life that treated people in ways that were self-evident then that we today regard as deeply wrong, so that we have changed as a people. Now, if you wanted to argue for a human right, and this is one of the features of this notion of human rights, namely what cannot be a human right. I mean, you could argue that X, Y, and Z are human rights. If you argued it simply as an individual, that will go nowhere. If you argue it as a part of a community, there are possibilities. Just like the African American community with allies, the community of women with allies could make an argument as a group. Sometimes those arguments can make a difference. They don't always. It also depends on what kind of society you are in making those arguments. And there's no guarantee. And moreover, there can be recursions or reversions to the past, a backsliding sometimes.
In your book, you talk about this need for a political community and a political community self-authoring their human rights. And one question I didn't know the answer to was, how do you find your political community? It's how do you determine, okay, I need a group of people to advocate for my rights with me. How do I determine who that is?
I, in many cases, would look to like-minded persons. If one is advocating for something in particular, one looks for other people that are advocating for the same idea. And by working together, by performing solidarity among themselves, giving themselves as much strength as they can as they face maybe a hostile or toxic environment, and to persevere. The community is political in my use of the word political in this particular sense, as the idea of an argument that is a contestation of a situation, of a status quo, of dominant arguments. When I think here of doing politics in a community, I think of a group of people who are arguing, we believe that that is mistaken. We believe that is wrong. We believe that should be changed for this, that reason, or that reason, and so forth. In many cases, those arguments will have no consequence, but sometimes they will. And again, we have historical examples of that.
So it sounds like you're looking for the other people who are also affected by the human rights violation, who have a sort of mutual interest in changing this.
The fact that humans who endure the same indignities or harms or injustices would share interests is obvious. However, it's also the case that one need not himself or herself be a victim of the marginalization or injustice to sympathize with those who are. It's argued in a book called The Creation of Human Rights that the development of the novel in Europe.
This is Lynn Hunt's book.
Lynn Hunt, yes.
She's been on my show.
Oh, yes, I saw that. Yes, yeah. Indeed. Well, she argues that perhaps the addressees of these epistolary novels were not the downtrodden, were not the victims, but were the victimizers, the people who had money, wherewithal, and could read and write. But upon reading, for example, how unpleasant the life of a maid was, it might occur to them for the first time. Yes, absolutely, I didn't see that. And in the American context, it's been argued that Uncle Tom's Cabin, which depicts African Americans as humans instead of caricatures or beasts, might have moved some white Americans to realize that they were miscategorizing, misunderstanding their fellow humans. And they may solidarize this. And one other, by the way, historical fact is that the civil rights movement of the 20th century it enjoyed a great deal of solidarity from the American Jewish community.
It sounds like that there is an element to this that you're describing that is a persuasion game. And anyone can do persuasion. And in fact, the people who have privilege or power might be in a better position to do persuasion.
Yes. And that means that one of the major political tasks of political community is to improve the conditions of communication. What does that mean? Education, information, access to being part of the dialogue. When we have voices that represent more of our community rather than less of our community, we will have more likely a more just community.
How do you handle when other people who are affected by the violation or the human rights issue don't recognize it? Because in your book, you talk about that and you give the example of survivors of female genital cutting, that very often women who come from those cultures, which I've interviewed several, they don't see it as a problem. This is normative. This is what we do here. But obviously the rest of the world doesn't see it that way.
A powerful example, the number of girls affected by this every year to this day is a tremendously large number.
So if you were a woman in one of those cultures who did feel the pain of that, how would you go about changing it?
Now, evidently, as I read the social scientific literature, the voice that is not so powerful, let's say if we're talking about this practice as practiced in Egypt, where it's illegal, but it's nonetheless practiced. If someone from North America or Western Europe were to go there and say, stop that, that's wrong, the addressees of that statement would be as insulted as if we reversed it. And if we here in this part of the world received guests who told us, stop that, you're doing it wrong. But a woman who herself has been cut, a mother, and stands up and says, I think this is mistaken. I will not have my daughter cut. We should not cut our daughters, is a powerful voice. It's very difficult to do. We all know how difficult it is to stand up and say, just a moment, I think you're all wrong. I think we're wrong. But that is a powerful voice. And I argue in the book that one might, in terms of this persuasion game, as you call it, think about what lies at hand. For example, very often this is practiced in poor communities. It's under unhygienic circumstances. And aside from the horrific nature of the practice as such, it also generates unintentionally illness. Surely the mothers that are taking their daughters to be, mothers who've been cut, taking their daughters then to be cut for the next generation, would be open to the argument. The idea of, I should say that female genital cutting is done for a variety of reasons, but one reason is as a marker of moving from girlhood into womanhood into puberty. And you could say, of course, this is of great moment to all human communities, but you happen to mark it in a way that unintentionally leads to the illness in many cases of your beloved daughters. Wouldn't it be better to do something that would never harm, would never hurt your daughter in a way that you don't want her to be hurt? For example, that might be one place to begin. There are, of course, other arguments in favor of female genital cutting that might not be open to that, such as it's necessary to control a woman's sexuality, or it is mandated by our faith. There are no faiths that mandate it, by the way. It's a misunderstanding of faith. And that's where persons of faith and knowledge should come in and say, no, you can't find that in our holy texts. But also maybe there are ideas of femininity or beauty that are constructions and can be changed.
From a persuasion perspective, though, is it stronger to say this is our inalienable God-given right? We have the right to our own bodies, and you're in violation of that. I mean, I know that framing is not a social construction framing, but if it is just an act of persuasion that we're doing, why not take an argument that is that strident?
that argument can be taken by both sides equally. And there you have no one can move forward because you just say, well, yes, you think it's an inalienable, but you're right. Here, I know the inalienable rights.
So you think they would flip around and say, well, this is our God-given duty?
Absolutely. That's in fact, let me give you a different example, which is not uncontroversial, but somewhat less controversial, and that's male circumcision on baby boys. And one might argue from the Western standpoint generally is that you have a right to bodily integrity. And if you want to modify your body, you might do so once you are, let's say, of age. You're an adult. But that adults should not modify the bodies of children who are not able to understand and are not able to object. And not being able to object, not to have a veto right, is one very significant form of marginalization and denial of dignity and rights. Now, one could say, well, then why don't we just make male circumcision illegal until you're 18? And then there are faiths that would say, but it's mandated by our faith. And respecting religious belief and religious practice to an extent is also, I think, a form of doing justice. It gets dicey where the argument is that this religious understanding has harmful consequences. And I believe that the scientists have not reached a conclusion about what the baby boy experiences, so on and so forth.
I don't know if you know this, but this is the subject of my first documentary. This male circumcision. Yeah. And this whole debate. Yeah, I mean, the research that I have seen is that pain is pain and it's traumatic.
And I think here, for example, if one wanted to persuade those faiths that practice is a matter of actually maybe textually justified practice, to say, well, we modify all our texts. We interpret all of our texts. And what one is trying to achieve through this practice probably could be achieved in some other way. It's a metaphor. And you could do the metaphor and the ritual in a different way that didn't impact the body of a human being, who, if he wants to do it when he's 18, okay, that's different.
The persuasion and the arguments, I am completely on board with that. I want to ask though about the persuasion versus cultural imperialism aspect, because you talk about how, it would be possible to say, well, these are the rules, we're going to make you follow them. And I guess I just want to know what would be wrong with that approach. Because I think if I was a woman in culture that practiced female circumcision and was feeling the harm of that, I might like it if a big country like the United States came in and said you can't do that anymore. It would be cultural imperialism, but, is it bad if it's for a cause that good?
I do argue for unilateral intervention in some cases, ethnic cleansing and genocide.
Sure.
There, we can't wait for arguments. And if that's cultural imperialism, I'll have a double helping. But in many other cases, what we should strive for is the free embrace of a way of looking at the world and looking at human beings and so forth, rather than a coercive imposition.
It sounds you're almost like describing a self-defense situation. Persuasion is ideal if we can talk someone down.
Yes.
But if there's a situation where the only way to save a life is to take a life, maybe self-defense is okay. Is that an accurate understanding?
Well, I mentioned genocide and ethnic cleansing, which are just not a life. We're talking about the effort to exterminate peoples. It's not to say that it's unacceptable to exterminate an individual, but those are, I think, that is of a moral magnitude greater than the question of male and female circumcision.
We were talking about when is cultural imperialism acceptable?
Well, in some sense, I would say that we should employ something of a nuanced understanding of this term, cultural imperialism. The term itself these days is a real negative term. It's a cultural. No one wants to be accused of imperialism. However, from my social constructivist point of view, argue that all morality and all ethics are a question of human perspective and of collective perspective. That doesn't guarantee that they are right in some ultimate sense, but I don't think we have access to ultimate senses. We can only judge it at the time by our best lights. And now I'm thinking of, for example, the tension between the West and authoritarian countries such as China and Russia, and among others. And I spent a lot of time in China. And in China, you might hear the claim that the most fundamental human right of all is to life. It's not implausible, and it is true that the communists who gained power in 1949 after the Civil War was the first government in China's 2,000-year-old, well, it's actually even older than that, the first Chinese government that actually overcame mass starvation. And that is a great achievement. However, I would argue that it's not necessary to restrict freedom of expression in order to feed people. I believe that the Chinese government and its apologists would beg to differ and say that China is a large country, 1.3 billion people, it's diverse, it's a very large country, and so forth, that we would have chaos if people had free expression and also free access to information. Now, what gives me pause here, I am very much an advocate of freedom of expression. I also believe that should be well understood as a core element of human dignity and of human rights. The right to say where I stand and to have the right to have my own stand and to have access to information. But I do acknowledge that the Chinese government, especially since 2000 or 2010, have made extraordinary strides in developing the material wealth of that country and providing the opportunity through the market of the normalization of China by European American standards in the terms of people, own an apartment and own a car and have a credit card and travel overseas and go to the university in large numbers and have access to a large number of consumer goods and so forth. And I ask myself, and I've met such people. In fact, I met it's an actual example. I was in Singapore summer before last, and I met a woman from India who was very happy in Singapore. Singapore is not as authoritarian as China, but it does restrict freedom of opinion, and you cannot criticize the government or the judiciary. Whereas you can in India. And this woman said, though, she would much rather be in Singapore. It's so much better. The quality of life in Singapore, indeed, is very high. And it has very little corruption and has other advantages. So this woman is saying to me, yeah, freedom of expression, it's not really so terribly important to people like me. I'm happy with being able to get ahead in life, not being the victim of corruption, being able to feed and clothe my children and to get a job and so on and to get ahead. And that gives me pause because from my perspective, and his perspective, those are important things, but they are not enough. I feel almost rage by a government that tells me what to think. Or generally, it's actually, and some people will agree with that. In many cases, people understand simply to hold your tongue, and you retreat into a kind of private niche of family and friends and consumerism, and you just don't talk about these things that are nonetheless very important to you. In my youth, I visited the Soviet Union and East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary and Poland. And I am so grateful for the experience because the repression was palpable in the air, in how people behaved. They know the stakes and they're very careful. But it seemed to me such a diminished life. And we know that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the former Soviet satellites were out of there. And even though we have people like Viktor Orban, who is going backwards to a more authoritarian system in general, no one wants to go back. And I don't think the Russians want to go back to Stalinist Russia or Brezhnev, even though Putin is doing his best to do something like that. So what I want to suggest here is that when I say that I realize that my perspective in favor of robust freedom of expression is not a universally shared perspective, I also believe that it's not the case that a lot of people simply are satisfied with material and medical and educational benefits.
It sounds like you're someone who's very capable of nuance. And whereas a different writer might just say, communism bad, you're able to say some things like establishing China's current economic prosperity or avoiding famine are good. We'd like to get those things without limitations on speech. And can we, similar to how you talk about human rights, can we just construct that a little bit better while keeping the good things?
Yes.
And it sounds like even around, we're talking earlier about genital cutting, we can say that the same is true of the cultures that practice that. There are good things about them. There are some good people there. There are things that we would like to keep, but can we change this one aspect?
Yes. With regard to the organization of states, what we have now in the West is the welfare state, which I define very narrowly as the state that takes responsibility for market failures, so that if you lose your job, you can get unemployment benefits, for example, or that there's some regulation of the economy so that children are not allowed to work, and that there are provisions for health and safety and welfare. The regulation of the market economy isn't anti-capitalist and doesn't destroy productivity. And it is better than laissez-faire. What I think the Chinese have is a very dynamic economy and I think a cultural ethos of hard work and a great investment in children for the future, that those goods would not, in fact, be threatened by freedom of expression. What is threatened in China by freedom of expression is the Communist Party. It's self-selected, and it will tolerate no opposition, and it wants to perpetuate itself forever. And it does so in part by not allowing freedom of expression. You can find this in all authoritarian countries. China would be better off, I believe. One of the problems in China is that this cabining or this prevention of freedom of expression, I think, doesn't allow for as much productivity in various areas. That productivity in the arts and in the sciences and elsewhere needs free exchange, robust exchange, and opposition and criticism and so forth. And I believe that, for example, robust freedom of expression in China would unleash even more the economic potential of that country.
It sounds like there's a persuasion element here that the changes you're asking for would be in their interest. But obviously, even if the majority of Chinese people were to want this, the people who have the power might not. And I'm curious how the persuasion approach works in a state or on an issue where the people who have power, it maybe isn't in their interests, or they're getting some benefit from continuing a human rights.
And that's an excellent question, because one of the factors of life that make political scientists quite humble is their proven poor record of predicting the future. Who knew that the Soviet Union would collapse around 1990? I don't think many people knew that in 1988.
Sure.
And the Soviet Union didn't collapse because of persuasion. It collapsed for internal reasons, and also I think it was losing the Cold War to the United States with regard to economy and armaments. And that collapse, though, made possible the transformation of any number of Eastern European countries into democracies. The embracing democracy was maybe a matter of persuasion, and there were arguments. Although that option was never given to the Russian people really in any strong sense. And so the sad answer and maybe conclusion is that it is not always possible to effect positive change through good arguments. In fact, doing so is more likely the exception than the rule. And in some cases, it might be other factors that bring about social change rather than good arguments. In fact, here, another historical example from our country, the famous Rosie the Riveter. As you know, in World War II, massive numbers of young American men were deployed overseas in the war effort. And this created a need for labor in factories, and women filled that need as a matter of necessity. Evidently, many women discovered in the process that they could do the work, that they liked doing the work, that they could earn a wage, they could earn a salary, and in fact, earning their own salary gave them a freedom to do things. In fact, if they had, for example, an abusive spouse, they could leave that spouse. If they had their own job, they weren't dependent on them and so forth. And when the boys came back in 1945, America maybe had been changed to an extent forever. Maybe the beginning of the serious integration of women into the economy, so that the integration of women into the economy now would be defended as a good thing, and one could marshal reasons. But it happened perhaps not because of planning and not because of arguments. This is the curious nature of our relationship as humans with our culture. We create culture in part, but culture creates us in part.
That relates to the next thing I want to ask you about, which is children's rights. That is a really difficult subject to apply these ideas to, because you talk about in your book communities self-authoring their rights, and acknowledge in the book that's not really something children can do. And so how should we approach that subject? Because children are the least powerful people in society, and yet at the same time have the least ability, they're the most in need of rights and least able to advocate for them.
Yes, the most vulnerable. Children require a great deal of taking care of. Our species is unique. I believe that when children are born, they're only half-baked. They're still developing. And they have to be taken care of intensively for years for them to survive. And indeed, for example, evidently, the front part of the brain where moral reasoning perhaps is located really isn't really complete until you're about 20 years old, I've read. And so children need to be taken care of. And the problem is that not all caretakers are good people, and that there can be visions of caretaking that are actually perverse. And what do you do? We need a system of paternalism that is rational and that is open to change and that can be contested and that is open to the public. So, for example, parents decide diets, and they may do so, for example, in part in terms of religious injunctions or so forth, or convictions about vegetarianism and so forth, and that's fine as long as the meals are nutritious. And we could use nutrition as the bottom line, that is to say. Now, the child is not going to demand this. It is for adults to patrol and control themselves toward a better paternalism. And the question that we adults must always ask ourselves is this truly in the best interests of the child? And were the child, an adult now, say, yes, I think that's the best way to go. For example, the child might say, I'd like another piece of candy, and no broccoli for me. And that, of course, is horrific for the child's health, but if the parent, but if the child is raised healthily and eats broccoli and only the occasional piece of candy, that healthy adult might say, "Thank God my parents didn't allow me to choose my own diet."
I guess the question I'm asking though is that a lot of the time that doesn't happen. So you'll have people say, "Well, my parents beat me and I turned out fine," and things like this, where they've experienced a childhood trauma and internalized it in some way and are now self-perpetuating it, and it occurs through culture. And, there's people who are raised in, we were talking earlier about religious beliefs that cause discord in the world or harm to people. If someone's raised in a tradition that involves a harmful practice, then they might go on as an adult to say, well, this is, I'm glad my parents did this. I feel good, even women who've experienced female genital cutting I've interviewed have framed it that way. So I guess the question is, how do you handle part of the challenge with children's rights is that children might experience harm at a time in their life when they can't process it. And then as adults, self-author meaning that it was okay to avoid the pain. And I guess the question is, how do you create children's rights or rights for a group that can't advocate for themselves? And when they reach the age where they're able to advocate for themselves, might author it differently because now they're in the position where they get to be a perpetuator of abuse.
Again, it's a question not for children, but for the adults that are the caretakers and the form of paternalism they practice. The best we can do is to try to persuade we adults, drawing upon sources of information such as medicine, so that we might be able to freely persuade ourselves that corporeal punishment is always wrong, and that spare the rod, spoil the child is a perverse way of making a human self-confident. That is to say, it might be that children who experience love and respect and support may themselves become responsible adults, and don't bear the pain and maybe the consequences of abuse. I don't believe that one can make a persuasive argument in favor of child abuse as a means to producing an admirable adult. It may be the case that humans who always interpret themselves and interpret their history cope well by trying to square an abusive childhood maybe with the residual affection for their parents, or a way of saying, I really wasn't harmed and it's okay. Humans are resilient, to be sure. But that fact is no argument in favor of abuse. More problematic, I think, is that adult who says, like the woman who says, well, yes, I endured. I was a female. My mother took me to the village woman to have my genitalia cut, and I think that's proper, and I'm fine, and I'm going to take my daughter. That person is the more challenging addressee of the argument that I disagree with your self-understanding.
Yeah.
And that is a very difficult argument. No one is going to easily accept that kind of challenge.
Yeah. Oh, it's the hardest argument. You're essentially telling someone your identity is wrong and your understanding of yourself is wrong. It's the most triggering thing you could say to a person.
Right. Although one's not necessarily saying that your entire identity is wrong.
Yeah.
That for example, in the case of female genital cutting, it might be that your understanding of female sexuality or the female body or of puberty or of generational rights um, is problematic because it generates these problems, and there are alternatives that would satisfy probably what you were trying to do in this way, but you could do it in another way that wouldn't be as problematic. Perhaps. I mean,
so they might even be correct that they're getting some positive benefit from it, and the false belief is that this is the only way or the best way to get that.
to be sure. And I think one of the most profound benefits is community.
Yeah.
Community it can be a wonderful thing. It's good. It's good for our health to be a member of a community, and a communal way of life is a better way of life along many dimensions. And so we are also always creatures of community. And the difficulty is to improve community without destroying a community, but then community itself can be used as a means to defend against outside criticisms or inside criticisms.
Yeah. I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because this actually segues into some stuff from your book on genetic engineering and the issues around that. Because I think in a lot of cases, you've talked about how we need a community to advocate for our rights. And a lot of times acknowledging a rights violation would threaten the community. So if I acknowledge, these parents were abusive, well, does that lose my community and my family? Or if I acknowledge that certain aspects of a religion are abusive, does that lose my status in that community? And in your book on dealing with the issues around genetic engineering, you mentioned the possibility of there at some point existing a right to freedom from certain genetic disabilities, that there's something that we could do to prevent those, that maybe people you could, instead of framing, freedom from genetic engineering, although there's some talk of maybe that's also a possibility in certain cases, that people could be free from disability. And the first thing that came to mind when I read that is that there are whole communities of people who believe in disability justice and a framing of that where, for example, deafness is a community. And if you were to cure their hearing, well, who do I belong to then? Who's my political community? And so there's a fear that even having a cure of some kind that would allow them to hear would cost them community. And I see a parallel there between, people who say, well, if I question genital cutting, then I lose my community. How would you solve that question of the need for community, and the fact that sometimes talking about human rights threatens that a little bit?
I would point to, as a matter of empirical observation, that communities are always already splintered to an extent. And so, for example, within the Catholic faith, you have people who regard themselves as good Catholics and follow the line from the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Although there are other bishops in this country in particular who regard the Pope as deeply mistaken. You have Catholic women who practice contraception and perhaps abortion and regard themselves as good Catholics, or who advocate for the right of women to be priests. They feel that the church that they still embrace is mistaken in some ways, and so you'll find this, I think, in any given faith. With regard to, and so there's tension, and things could break down. Famously, Martin Luther just wanted to be a good Catholic boy, and the rest is history. And these things happen. But I want to go back. I want to talk about this question of disability. It's very, very important. And first, I want to acknowledge that also, as a matter of advocating for rights, that the disabled community in many parts has come together in various ways and speaks and publishes and has journals and advocates and so forth. And we've learned a great deal, for example, that many disabled persons do not regard themselves as having a quality of life inferior to that of other persons and so forth. And it must also be said that the idea of preventing genetic disabilities in the future through gene editing is not intended to declare disabled people inferior, but it is also inescapable that claim would seem to be wounding. Now, when I speak in my book, Creating Human Nature, the political challenges of genetic engineering, I distinguish different types of targets for genetic engineering. There are conditions that no one would defend: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, cancer. And there I argue that if it were possible, it's not possible, but if it were possible, and it might be possible one day, that we had a society that had the economic wherewithal and the technical ability and the scientific understanding to genetically edit an embryo that indicated the possibility of these types of scourges, that we could seriously entertain the notion that that society would be obligated to undertake that kind of engineering. That not to do so might be construed, perhaps by analogy, to child abuse in some sense. Here we're talking about a future child, a future person. Now, other disabilities or other conditions have to be evaluated differently. And the question of deafness is one that has generated a great deal of commentary. Deaf parents, as I argue in my book, might well regard deafness as an aspect of their community. Deafness is not a lack, it's a language. Italians prefer to speak Italian, and maybe deaf people prefer that way of life, and they want their children, like so many parents, want their children to be part of that. Now, this is more problematic.
I thought you were going to say that Italians also speak sign language, which my family certainly does.
Well, there you go. Here, again, I would say that the question, I like to think, well, what would that future person want if the future person herself could have decided when the embryo from which I came could have been edited in such a way that I wouldn't be deaf? Would I have chosen that? And I suspect in many cases that they might. It is. This in part is a question of parenting, which is complex. Any parent knows. And on the one hand, parents really want to form their children in ways that conform with their understanding of life politically, religiously, and in other ways. And there can be a great deal of satisfaction that comes from that, and that can be very good in part, but it is also the case as an aspect of what we are as humans. We are frail, and all of us are limited, and all of us have some blinders, even our dear parents. And I think that ideally one of the gifts of a public education is the idea of a community saying, love your parents and respect your parents and take some from your parents, but your parents can't be the last word. And realize also the parents we want our children to go beyond us. And that's not always easy to want as a parent. And I think that I ask myself, couldn't a hearing child of deaf parents be a very strong member of a deaf community in as far as he or she could speak deaf language perfectly and interact and understand, but also can have the pleasures and benefits conferred by hearing as well? It's maybe like being bilingual. You don't have to give up Italian if you learn English. And what gives pause is any condition that's irreversible. I mean, it would be, I think everyone would agree it would be wrong to take an embryo that doesn't indicate any genetic disposition toward deafness and to edit that embryo so that it would be deaf.
Right.
And I think that fact tells us something.
Yeah.
That while we admire the community that deaf people have, and we need to understand the beauty of it, we who are not part of that community, that the drive or the desire to keep children part of it is problematic. A different example from in the case of religion and law, and I'm thinking of a Supreme Court case, Yoder v. Wisconsin, the old order Amish in Ohio. Like Amish everywhere, reject many aspects of modern life, and they may lead very good lives that are agriculturally based. They live in a state. States make laws with regard to education, and they may mandate 10 years of public education. In this case, in Wisconsin, the Amish argued to be allowed to keep their pubescent children down on the farm for an alternative education. Maybe they should only be required to go to public education until they are 8th grade, and then back to the farm where they learn things. Why? Because the feeling that kids who are getting to that age are very, very susceptible to peer influence, much more than anything else, and that the parents fear that their children will be, in a certain sense, seduced by the modern world in ways that will encourage the children to leave. They always have the right to leave when they're 18, of course, as a matter of legal rights. But the parents may feel that the children are more likely to choose the Amish way of life if they weren't exposed to the outside world. And surprisingly, the Supreme Court found for the Amish, I say surprisingly because generally exceptions to a general rule on the basis of religious belief are not supported by the interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court. But in this case, it did. And one argument was, well, if Johnny wants to become a NASA space scientist, he's not going to be able to do so on the basis of 8 years of public education and then education out on the farm. But the argument is that okay, he's 18, he's out of there, and he can still recover. He has enough time. He could recover whatever he didn't get in those years and still become. That's to be distinguished, let's say, from when the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, said, well, our religion mandates polygamy. And the argument is if you want to join the United States of America, the territory of Utah, where you have a large number of Mormons, our understanding is that legal equality between men and women includes that multiple wives cannot be equal to one husband. Now there are Mormons and other people who would argue, I think that's mistaken. But in fact the Mormon Church did change, and the Mormon Church does not officially support polygamy, and I think they can observe that their faith did not fall apart. Meanwhile, the perspective that legal equality between men and women requires it does not allow for polygamy. The majoritarian view has been preserved. It is a perspective, and encouraging and not holding, in this case, for right of religious freedom. Was the right way of going, because if women are exposed from childhood through life to a polygamous system, then they cannot recover what the majority regards as a life full of opportunities and so forth, whereas that young Amish boy or girl could recover, if you will, the opportunities that he or she otherwise would have had he or she not gone back to the farm for reasons of the parents' belief system.
I see two things in some of what you're bringing up, which is, I think on the part of the group or community perpetuating a human rights issue, there's a fear that if they don't do it, that person will leave. In other words, if we let someone get a secular education, if they're through gene editing different than us in some way, that we'll lose the connection. And it sounds like that there's almost a false belief there that the issue is a way to preserve connection, which doesn't seem to be the case. And in some cases, harming that person is what drives them away.
There are many forms of community.
Yeah.
What is, and there are good, there are, I think, communities that are positive and communities that are negative. I mean, communities that engage in abuse, it seemed to be, should be condemned. The question is, though, if we're defining the abuse only as an outsider, then why should the insider be persuaded? And so the argument in the case of female genital cutting or perhaps male circumcision is changing a child's body where the child has no input would appear to be problematic for many people. You can't just do anything to a child, and in this case, you're making a profound change to the body. Whereas if you said that if that change to the body is important, then allow the young adult to do it freely and so forth. Ask, what you wait.
You're preaching to the choir.
The community that practices it, some members might be open to this idea. It's.
I interviewed in my documentary a woman who willingly chose female genital cutting at 18, and she wanted that for the benefits she felt like it conferred and the belonging in her community. And I kind of understand it from almost a hazing perspective. There's people who go through really crazy stuff to belong to a fraternity or a sorority, and they feel like that creates belonging for them. So I understand, but the choice, it sounds like the second thing I was going to bring up is that a lot of the examples we're giving have to do with irreversible issues. And the ones that it sounds like you're most willing to intercede with some form of force on are things like genocide or death, which is the most irreversible thing you can do to someone.
Well, genetic engineering can also be irreversible. Yeah. So consider here an example of reversibility and non-reversibility. If a person experiences an abusive childhood and has psychological problems as a consequence as an adult, he or she might seek psychotherapy as a way to deal with and maybe overcome some of those problems through interpretation And that so what is available through psychotherapy might be able to reverse some of the consequences. Whereas if one changes the embryo, the consequences are not reversible. It is a fait accompli, and the individual is constrained to accept it. That's why I often advocate in my book on genetic engineering that communities of adults should always ask, what would the arguments be of the future person who would grow from this embryo? What would be plausible that they would argue? I think we could say they would plausibly argue, yes, I'd be better out with cancer. I'd be better off without these. Now, would I be better off as a hearing child in a deaf community? That is more problematic.
So I'll just ask the big question in that book. Do we have a right to be free from genetic engineering? Or the answer might be more complex than that black and white question, but do we?
In a sense, we cannot be free of genetic engineering. Consider that we humans, our species, has already genetically modified itself in certain ways. With the domestication of plants and animals in the Middle East some 10,000 years ago, human communities were able to develop abundance of food, and that allowed for the creation of science and religion and philosophy and cities and so on and so forth. Many other things followed from that. But it involved our changing our diet. And the majority of what we eat when we eat fruits and vegetables and meat are foods that have been modified by genetic engineering, not at the molecular level that's possible today, but through artificial breeding and artificial selection. So that, for example, the domestication of goats and cows that produce milk provided a fantastic source of protein that humans should control. The human body, as evolved, generally shuts down the capacity to metabolize mother's milk, in the baby. And so if you drink milk after that, it'll cause us pain. But with time, people get mutations and so forth. And when people are lactose tolerant, it makes life easier in terms of this abundant food source. And here we are. And so we've already modified ourselves, and we modify ourselves in a variety of ways, right? Our biology is connected to our culture, which is connected to our biology. It's a loop in some ways. And we can't escape even some of the biological consequences of our culture. Now, that you could still, though, insist that you're asking quite specifically about gene editing in a laboratory or in a hospital or what have you. And there, I would say, again, to come back to certain genetic diseases that are horrific, that to insist on a right not to have been genetically engineered will have the consequence of humans who will be born into miserable conditions, biological conditions, that was not necessary. That could have been prevented. And it strikes me as perverse to choose, if you will, a right to misery, where misery under these conditions is hardly a matter of interpretation, because the physical conditions, the largest number of conditions affect infants and born into horrible circumstances. Our capacity to prevent those forms of misery, I believe, that we should make into a moral imperative. We should make into a moral imperative, reduce human suffering as much as possible when we have the capacity to do so. I think we should make that a moral obligation, and that would reject the notion of a right not to have been genetically engineered. Now, one might say that there might be forms of genetic engineering that one should have a right to be free from. And here I would think not of genetic engineering oriented towards therapy, towards preventing a terrible condition, but genetic engineering intended maybe to enhance perfectly healthy people to be whatever parents or society deems as attractive, or, height, skin pigmentation, athleticism, and so for intelligence. Those might be forms of genetic engineering that we should insist a right to be free from.
I remember there being something in the book about genetic engineering for increased intelligence. Or were you framing that in the book as towards a cognitive ability to participate in the world, not necessarily trying to make someone a 400 IQ super person?
Absolutely, yes. Let me briefly review that argument. It's controversial, but here I was interested in making an argument for a form of genetic engineering specifically for persons who have severe cognitive disability. If it were possible, and if it ever becomes possible, to scan an embryo and to diagnose the possibility of severe cognitive disability, I argue that we, society, should engineer that embryo in a very particular way, not towards intelligence that is extraordinary in any sense, but rather, and if it were possible to do this, to determine some kind of threshold of intelligence necessary for full participation in a liberal democratic community and the capacity to realize one's civil rights. That this would be a political argument, not to create Einstein, but to prevent the exclusion from the political process of persons who would otherwise be excluded on the basis of severe cognitive disability. Now, if such a person were edited and then had a cognitive capacity that would allow them to fully participate, that doesn't mean that they have to, but at least they could decide. But someone who suffers from severe cognitive disability is not able to decide, and I argue against those scholars who say, well, there are forms of paternalism where someone can make your choices for you, and that's perfectly fine. I am unpersuaded by that form of paternalism. I really believe that when it comes to politics and political issues, the ideal is the sovereign individual, to the extent possible, informed, and by his or her best lights, making informed decisions. Of course, this is an argument that is of interest only in liberal democratic communities, not so much in authoritarian communities.
Yeah, I was going to say, what is the argument against giving someone 400 IQ, super strength? These are all qualities that I think a lot of people would want if they could get them. So why not?
First of all, it would lead, I think, to terrible consequences in certain ways. First of all, one would see that those members of society and groups in society who are already well positioned would use these means to position themselves all the better. You would get already a greater inequality than we have today because of the expense and availability and so forth.
So the rich would get richer genetically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And moreover, by the way, there is no upper bound. In other words, this is called positional inequality. If everybody is 5'9", then and one person is 6, that person who's 6 feet tall and might seem to have the advantage in terms of height. Well, but if everybody who's 5'9" could be 6, then that 6 foot is no longer an advantage. And you can see that this would be
an arms race.
An arms race. And then also, I think that it would it would very unwisely empower human preference in the sense that the diversity that we observe among ourselves is positive along so many dimensions. I said on the one hand that genetically we are more or less identical as representatives of our species on the one hand, but our differences are also wonderful in many ways. Height, ability, skin pigmentation, eye color, capacities, and so forth. If we could mass produce ourselves according to whims, we might destroy ourselves. We would all look like Barbie and Ken, I suppose, or whatever the fashion was, and so forth. And I can imagine it would put forms of racism on steroids and other negative human emotions. I think we want to preserve human diversity along many dimensions, not diversity in terms of, well, some people have cancer and some don't. If we could all not have cancer, that would be very good. But when it comes to intelligence, for example, I think we want to overcome what we would regard as a disability, but then embrace the outcomes of natural reproduction in a range of abilities, just as we can embrace it in terms of a range of abilities and appearances and so forth. It would be humans don't have the wisdom and will never have the wisdom to manufacture a unified species in terms of natural talents and so forth.
G.K. Chesterton, in his book Against Eugenics, which was published in the 1920s, makes a very similar argument. He says central planning of humanity has so many ways it could go wrong, and no one actually knows what they're doing.
Yes, I would focus on therapy for harmful conditions. I would be very skeptical about efforts to enhance perfectly healthy people.
We're getting to the close of our time, and I have a few more things I want to ask if we can fit them in. But is there anything that I didn't ask you that you really were hoping to talk about or want to get to?
One question might be, how is a book on human rights as social construction connected to a book on the political challenges of genetic engineering, in as much as they come from the same author, and many authors, and certainly this author, basically has one thing to say and says it in a variety of ways. I don't have a rich menu. Most writers don't. And so you're hearing from the same person with the same ideas on two very different topics. How are they connected? Excellent question.
I actually had an answer to that question that I came to in my own reading of them, but your answer, I'm sure, is more accurate.
Oh, I don't know. Sometimes the reader understands the writer better than the writer does himself. In both cases, I argue that the moral nobility of our species lies precisely in doing our collective best to develop guidelines for, in one case, a more just society, and in the other case, for the deployment of science and biotechnology towards healthier bodies and minds, that we undertake both tasks without any guidelines from anything other than ourselves, in as much as these are moral questions, and that is breathtaking, and we need to embrace the task and do the best we can, and we can do better rather than worse, although we cannot do without making mistakes, but that we should not, or that it's mistaken for a variety of reasons, to seek recourse to the notion of guidelines from some other reality that some group posits. This is the moral task of our species. Despite all of our many differences, it is a task that we share as a species. And by doing better rather than worse, we ennoble ourselves morally. That's how the two books are connected.
Could I summarize that as it's up to us to figure it out?
Not only is it is up to us, but moreover that there is a moral dimension to it being up to us. We are challenged, and we can meet the challenge in ways that, to some extent, we can see that we've done better or worse. And even though it's nerve-wracking when we contemplate all the mistakes that we have made and the mistakes that we can make and probably to some extent will make in the future, it is the task. And we need to concentrate on doing the best we possibly can because it will make a difference. And that gives our species its ultimate meaning. And we humans need meaning. I think we evolved creatures need meaning, but we can find that meaning only collectively in our collective selves, the moral depths within, as we observe the starry, starry heavens above.
I think that's a really good note to end on. Thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brendon Marotta Show. If you liked this episode, please leave a positive review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. If you really liked this episode, please support the show and become a paying subscriber, giving you access to special bonus material only available to supporters of the show. I want to thank you for listening to this show, and I will talk to you all later.